The CNN studio was buzzing under the glare of bright lights as producers adjusted cameras and makeup artists applied final touches. In the center of it all, Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota straightened her navy blazer and took a deep breath. It was supposed to be just another routine interview on Anderson Cooper 360. But what happened next would ignite a global firestorm. Anderson Cooper, with his silver hair and signature calm intensity, leaned forward in his chair. "Governor Noem," he began. "With rising global tensions and America's shifting role on the world stage, how should we respond to the new wave of African leadership, especially those claiming to represent democracy?" Noem nodded slightly, her eyes sharp. She knew exactly the kind of answer that would make headlines. But no one in the studio, none of the 200 audience members watching live, could have anticipated how far her words would travel. "Look, Anderson," she said firmly, "we have to be brutally realistic about who we're calling leaders." She paused. "Take Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, for example. This is someone claiming to lead a country of over 22 million people." She leaned forward, her tone turning skeptical. "But what's his background? Where's the formal diplomatic education? The experience in international relations?" A few heads in the audience turned. Some shifted in their seats. "Leadership isn't just about passion and populist slogans," she continued. "It's about intelligence, credentials, training, proven experience with global policy." The air in the studio tightened. Even Anderson Cooper blinked. Within minutes, clips of her remarks were cut, captioned, and launched across every social media platform. Twitter lit up. Facebook groups debated. TikTok creators reacted in real time. The phrase "Noem versus Traoré" trended globally within the hour. What was intended as a pointed political comment quickly evolved into something far bigger. A heated worldwide debate about what qualifies someone to lead, what counts as intelligence, and who gets to decide. In just a few hours, Kristi Noem had gone from local governor to global lightning rod. And while her words were still echoing across American airwaves, a very different kind of storm was quietly gathering strength far away, in the heart of West Africa. And Ibrahim Traoré? He was listening. By midnight, the spark had become a wildfire. Governor Noem's remarks about Ibrahim Traoré were no longer just a political soundbite. They had detonated across 6 continents like a cultural earthquake. On Twitter, hashtags like #Noem vs Traoré and #African Intelligence surged to the top within hours. Debates broke out in newsrooms, college dorms, group chats, and embassy boardrooms. The world wasn't just watching, it was responding. In the United States, conservative commentators rushed to defend Noem. "She's asking fair questions," tweeted Fox News analyst Sarah Mitchell to her 500,000 followers. In today's complex world, shouldn't we expect international leaders to have formal education, proven diplomatic skills, and track records in global policy? Cable panels echoed the same talking points. Phrases like unconventional leader, lack of credentials, and instability risk floated across every screen. But across Africa, the reaction was something else entirely. It wasn't political, it was personal. Dr. Amina Kone, a political scientist at the University of Ghana, an Oxford PhD, didn't hold back. "This is the exact colonial arrogance we've fought for generations," she posted. "To suggest that leadership requires a Western degree is not just ignorant, it's insulting." Her post went viral in hours, sparking a movement. Stories poured in from Lagos, Nairobi, Dakar, and Kinshasa, stories of leaders, scientists, and organizers who had transformed their communities without ever stepping foot inside a Western lecture hall. Young Africans flooded social media with clips of Traoré speaking eloquent, thoughtful, sharp. Volunteers translated his speeches into French, Portuguese, Arabic, and English, highlighting his deep knowledge of economics, security, and diplomacy. The message was loud and clear. "We do not need your permission to lead." In Burkina Faso's capital of Ouagadougou, street vendors, Students and elders gathered around outdoor TVs and radios. The tone was electric equal parts, pride and fury. 23-year-old activist Fatu Sankara stood on a wooden crate in the middle of a crowded market and declared, "They still think we need their approval? We freed ourselves from colonial chains. We don't need Ivy League nods to validate our intelligence." The crowd roared. The energy had shifted. By the morning, it was no longer just about Traoré or Noem. It was about who gets to define intelligence, who gets to be called qualified, and why those definitions always seem to come from the same places. The internet had chosen its battlefield, and Traoré? Still silent. But not for long. While the West argued qualifications, the streets of Ouagadougou were already alive with something else: conviction. In the early light of morning, Burkina Faso's capital pulsed with an energy that couldn't be ignored. Radios crackled in barbershops. Market stalls played news clips on dusty televisions. Everywhere, people were talking not just about what Governor Noem had said, but about what it meant. To them, to Africa, to the world. In a crowded outdoor market near the old train station, a young woman stood atop a wooden fruit crate. Her name was Fatu Sankara, a 23-year-old community organizer with fire in her voice and conviction in her bones. She wasn't elected. She didn't have a fancy degree. But when she spoke, the crowd listened. "They think we need their permission to lead?" she called out, arms raised above the crowd. "They think intelligence comes from sitting in an air-conditioned classroom while our children die from diseases that medicine could have cured?" Vendors stopped stacking mangoes. Motorcycle taxi drivers killed their engines. Even street kids paused their game of soccer with a makeshift ball. Fatu's voice rose. "Who fought the French when they took our land? Who stood up when corporations tried to buy our rivers? Who's teaching our children when the schools are falling apart?" The crowd grew. People leaned in from nearby rooftops. Elder women clapped. Young men nodded with tight fists held high. Her message cut deeper than any online debate because it was rooted in daily life. In another part of the city, university students gathered under a neem tree to hold a spontaneous discussion circle. They weren't talking test scores or grade point averages. They were talking survival, history, and leadership built in the trenches, not handed down from institutions thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, street artists began painting murals on cracked concrete wall images of Traoré with calloused hands, children studying by candlelight, mothers hauling buckets of water beneath the sun. These weren't just political statements. They were declarations of identity, of ownership, of a different kind of brilliance. The Western media saw silence from Traoré, but in Ouagadougou, that silence felt deliberate, almost strategic. It was the silence of a man who knew that sometimes letting your people speak first is the loudest message of all. In the markets, the schools, the alleyways and kitchens, one phrase kept echoing. "We do not need their validation. We know who we are." And with each passing hour, that voice was growing louder. While the world raged on, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. Inside the modest presidential office in Ouagadougou, there was no marble floor, no gold trim, no lavish art on the walls, just war maps, stacks of economic reports, and a wooden cross nailed near the window, the only keepsake left from his late mother, Mariam. It had been nearly 48 hours since Governor Noem's remarks lit up global airwaves. Journalists called it cowardice. Some called it indifference. But those closest to Traoré knew better. He wasn't hiding. He was calculating. Colonel Abdul Maiga, his closest aide and longtime brother-in-arms, stepped into the room, holding a tablet glowing with headlines from CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC. The scrolling flood of commentary, hashtags, opinion pieces, it was overwhelming. "Mr. President," Abdul said softly, "the pressure is rising by the hour. They're demanding a response." Traoré didn't look up. His fingers were tracing the edge of a faded photograph of his mother, holding him as a child, barefoot in a dusty village, smiling despite it all. She had passed away, when he was only a teenager, lost to a treatable illness they simply couldn't afford to treat. She died, he whispered, because we couldn't buy a $12 vial of antibiotics. But I'm the one being called unqualified. Abdul sat across from him, patient, quiet. Sir, he said finally, with all due respect, some of our own citizens are starting to wonder if your silence means weakness. Traoré stood up slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the city breathed as always, children kicking old soccer balls down red clay roads, mothers hauling water, street vendors shouting prices over the roar of motorcycles. The people he served, the people he never forgot. When, he asked, did we begin measuring our worth by the approval of people who've never stood in our shoes, who've never had to choose between medicine or food? He turned, his eyes sharp now, burning with clarity. Let them question my background. Let them laugh at my lack of credentials. But they don't know what kind of intelligence it takes to survive on less than $1 a day, or to lead a country left in pieces by centuries of theft and neglect. Abdul didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because at that moment, he knew Traoré wasn't retreating. He was preparing. And when he finally spoke, the world wouldn't just listen. It would remember. Back in Washington, D.C., the ripple effects were becoming tidal waves. By Thursday morning, the U.S. State Department found itself in the middle of a diplomatic storm it hadn't planned for. Calls poured in from African embassies' ambassadors demanding clarification. Meetings were rescheduled. Interviews canceled. Behind closed doors, aides scrambled to contain what was quickly spiraling out of control. At a hastily arranged press conference, Secretary of State Jennifer Walsh stood before a sea of flashing cameras and tried to strike a calm tone. Governor Noem's comments reflect her personal views, she said carefully, and do not represent the official position of the United States government or the administration's stance on African leadership. The room buzzed. It was a necessary disclaimer, but far too late. The damage wasn't just done, it was spreading fast. In Nairobi, Kenya's Minister of Foreign Affairs postponed a planned trade discussion with U.S. delegates, citing the need for cultural reflection. In Accra, Ghana, a student delegation canceled their participation in a U.S. Embassy exchange program, stating they no longer felt respected. On African news networks, panelists debated whether America's soft power was beginning to erode not because of weapons or policies, but because of words. Even military cooperation was beginning to wobble. In Bamako and Niamey, local commanders began questioning the terms of ongoing training programs. If our leaders are seen as unqualified, one Burkinabe officer told a local paper, why are we working with theirs? Meanwhile, in American universities, something unexpected was happening. Conversations were shifting. At Howard University's African Studies Department, Professor Marcus Johnson abandoned his usual syllabus and turned his classroom into a live debate forum. Students lined the walls. The topic: colonial hangovers and who gets to define leadership. This isn't just about Traoré, Johnson told the room. This is about centuries of conditioning where validation flows one way and respect is earned only if it comes wrapped in a Western diploma. A hand shot up Kesha Williams, a junior from Detroit. Professor, isn't it fair to ask if someone running a country should have formal training in global affairs? Johnson smiled. That's the right question, he said. But the deeper one is what counts as training. Is it 4 years at Georgetown or 20 years in the trenches of national survival? The room went silent because in that moment, it became clear this wasn't just a political controversy. It was a global reckoning. And somewhere across the Atlantic, Ibrahim Traoré was getting ready to speak. Back in Burkina Faso, the stage was being quietly set. Inside the communications wing of the presidency, a small team of advisors, media technicians, and translators worked around the clock. No shouting, no chaos, just focus. Everyone knew what was coming, and everyone knew it had to be perfect. Ibrahim Traoré had made a decision. He would speak. But not from a grand stage, not from behind a golden podium, or in front of foreign dignitaries. Instead, he chose the National Assembly building, a place of concrete walls, wooden benches, and historic gravity. A place where laws were written, revolutions had stirred, and voices from every corner of the country had once been heard. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Across Africa, television networks cleared primetime schedules. In villages without electricity, locals organized battery-powered radios and solar-charged projectors. In city cafes, students hung banners and prepped watch parties. Even influencers on TikTok and Instagram posted countdowns. Something big was coming, and people felt it. The man who had said nothing was finally ready to say everything. That night, just hours before the address, Traoré stood in front of the mirror in his small, dimly lit bathroom. There was no tailored suit, no luxury cufflinks. He reached for the only outfit he had ever worn as a leader. A plain military uniform, faded, functional, and deeply symbolic. His wife, Jamila, entered quietly. Her presence brought calm. She didn't speak politics, but she understood burden. "The children," she said gently, "are asking why Papa is on television again." He smiled faintly, adjusting the collar of his uniform. "What did you tell them?" "I told them their father is teaching the world something," she replied, smoothing his shirt with the same care she once gave when he was just a young officer returning home from the field. "Something important about where we come from, and why we'll never forget." For a moment, he said nothing. His mind drifted to Bondokui, the village of his childhood, to walking 5 miles to a one-room school with no books and no lights, to his father selling the family's only cow just so he could take entrance exams, to the hunger, the loss, the sacrifice. Then he looked into the mirror. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. Outside, the city of Ouagadougou hummed. But inside the heart of its president, something quiet, powerful, and unshakable had taken root. Tomorrow, the world would hear him not as a man defending himself, but as a voice speaking for millions who never had the chance. At exactly 8 p.m. local time, the doors of the National Assembly creaked open. Inside, there were no foreign dignitaries, no celebrity guests, no elite press. The audience was hand-picked farmers, teachers, nurses, students, and small shopkeepers. People whose names would never appear in headlines, but whose daily lives carried the weight of the nation. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the wooden platform, the chamber fell silent. Dressed in the same uniform he had worn since his earliest days as a young officer, he looked more like a soldier than a head of state. But in that moment, he didn't need titles. He had presence. "My fellow Burkinabe, my African brothers and sisters, and to all citizens of the world watching tonight," he began, his voice clear, steady, grounded. "I stand before you not to defend my intelligence or to justify my qualifications. I stand here to tell you the truth about where leadership is born." He gripped the edges of the podium, rough, calloused hands from years spent not behind desks, but in the field. Around his neck, a simple wooden cross, the last gift from his late mother. "Governor Noem questions my background," he said, his tone even. "She speaks of credentials, diplomas, the proper pedigree for leadership. I do not come from that world. And perhaps that's exactly why we see leadership so differently." Cameras from across the continent captured every word. "I was born in Bondokuya village without running water or electricity. My mother walked miles each day just to fetch water. My father sold our family's only cow so I could attend school. Not because he believed in Harvard or Yale, but because he believed knowledge, any knowledge could free us." In the crowd, heads bowed. Some wept. Others stared straight ahead, their faces hardened with memory. "Where I come from," Traoré continued, "intelligence doesn't mean multiple degrees. It means knowing how to survive a drought, how to treat a wound with no medicine, how to hold a grieving mother and promise her child's death won't be in vain." The chamber was still. This isn't about East versus West, or rich versus poor. This is about redefining what we call intelligence, and who gets to decide what leadership looks like. He paused, scanning the room not as a man pleading his case, but as one inviting the world to reconsider its lens. Because sometimes, real brilliance doesn't come from above. It rises from the ground. As Ibrahim Traoré's words echoed through the assembly hall, something extraordinary was happening outside its walls. In homes, internet cafes, classrooms, and market stalls across the globe, people weren't just watching. They were feeling. On social media, the hashtag number Real Leadership surged like a wave. Within minutes, it was trending across continents: North America, Europe, South America, Asia. People from all walks of life began sharing their own stories. A single mother in the Philippines who built a sewing business from scratch. A war refugee in Syria who now teaches computer science. A coal miner's daughter from Appalachia who became a nurse during the pandemic. Traoré's message had struck a global nerve. In Seattle, a coffee shop full of college students fell into a hush as the live stream played from a laptop. A young barista whispered, "I've never heard a politician speak like this." Across the Atlantic, in Stockholm, a group of professors at a late-night dinner paused mid-meal. One of them simply said, "This changes everything." In Sao Paulo, in Mumbai, in Toronto, small gatherings of strangers became makeshift listening circles. People tuned in not for political theater, but because something real was unfolding. And then there were the stories. Videos of children studying by candlelight. Nurses in remote clinics treating patients with empty shelves. Farmers finding ways to irrigate dusty fields using broken buckets and borrowed hope. Suddenly, the world was looking at intelligence through a new lens, not as something bestowed, but something earned. Back in Ouagadougou, Aminata Urago, a nurse, who had once received critical supplies from Traoré, during a shortage washed with tears in her eyes. "This isn't politics," she whispered to a fellow nurse. "This is testimony." At Harvard's Kennedy School, Professor Elizabeth Chen had done something she'd never done in her 20-year career. She canceled her lecture mid-session. Her graduate students, all future diplomats and policy analysts, were watching Traoré's speech projected on the wall. "This," she said softly, "is a masterclass in leadership communication." He's not defending his resume. He's redefining the entire conversation. It was no longer about Kristi Noem, or Burkina Faso, or even Africa. It was about all of us. How we measure worth, where we find wisdom, and whether we truly understand the faces behind the titles we so easily judge. Because in that moment, the world wasn't asking whether Traoré was qualified. It was asking how many voices like his we've ignored. By now, the speech wasn't just being heard, it was being studied. Across think tanks and university halls, analysts sat stunned. Traoré hadn't taken the bait. He didn't attack Governor Noem. He didn't lash out. He didn't play the victim. Instead, he had done something far more powerful. He reframed the entire debate. He turned criticism into a conversation. In classrooms from Dakar to Denver, professors were tossing out planned lessons and playing clips from his address. What they saw wasn't defiance, it was diplomatic genius. And what they heard wasn't defense, it was a challenge to the status quo. "He's not answering Noem," said one political science student in Atlanta. "He's answering a question that's been asked for centuries: who gets to lead, and why?" At a diner in South Dakota, Governor Noem's home state truck driver, Mike Patterson, sat glued to the mounted television above the counter. The speech played on a global news loop. Coffee in hand, he squinted, leaned closer. "You know," he said to the waitress, "this guy's talking about things my granddad used to say, about the Great Depression, about scraping by. Maybe college ain't the only way to be smart." The waitress, Maria Santos, whose mother cleaned offices for 15 years to put her through school, nodded slowly. "My mom didn't finish 6th grade, she said, but she knew things no textbook could teach. Half a world away at Harvard." Professor Elizabeth Chen gathered her graduate seminar for a rare evening session. The topic? Redefining leadership in post-colonial contexts. But tonight, the class wasn't theoretical. It was watching a live case study unfold in real time. This is a pivot point, Chen told her students. He's not defending his lack of Western education. He's elevating lived experience as a form of wisdom equal, maybe even superior, to academic pedigree. Some students nodded. Others just stared, realizing they were witnessing something they weren't taught to expect. Authentic power without credentials. Meanwhile, Traoré's team watched in quiet awe from the control room backstage. Every minute, new reports came in: watch parties in Uganda, translation volunteers in Tunisia, a village elder in Malawi, calling the speech a mirror we've needed for years. Traoré hadn't just changed the narrative. He had owned it, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with the quiet strength of a man who had nothing to provide, everything to show. And the world? It was finally ready to listen. As Ibrahim Traoré approached the close of his speech, the room leaned in. The weight of his words was not in their volume, but in their truth. He wasn't trying to be impressive. He was being honest. And somehow, that made every word thunder louder than applause. I do not question Governor Noem's intelligence, he said plainly, nor her right to lead her people, but I ask her, and all of us, to consider this. Intelligence forged in struggle is no less real than intelligence earned in a classroom. The silence in the National Assembly was profound, not out of awkwardness, but reverence. Even seasoned politicians looked humbled. Journalists stopped scribbling notes. Some just listened, eyes wide, as if seeing leadership differently for the first time. Traoré continued, his tone steady. I have made decisions that determined whether children lived or died. I've sat across from armed men and negotiated peace not with prepared speeches, but with empathy and resolve. I've held grieving mothers and told them their loss would not be in vain. He paused and looked directly into the camera. Tell me what university teaches that? In that moment, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about nurses in overcrowded clinics, fathers in war zones, teachers in forgotten schools. It was about everyone who had ever been told they weren't qualified enough to matter. And across the world, people felt seen. At the speech's end, Traoré didn't ask for validation. He didn't seek approval. He simply said, leadership is not a title. It's a burden you carry for others. The broadcast ended. The lights dimmed. But something had shifted. In homes from Burkina Faso to Baltimore, in classrooms from Cape Town to Chicago, people weren't just inspired. They were changed, because what they had witnessed wasn't a defense. It was a redefinition. And as the final line echoed into the night, one truth stood above all. You don't need permission to lead. Not when you've lived the cost of silence. Not when you've earned your voice in the fire of real life. Ibrahim Traoré didn't win a debate that night. He lit a torch. And the world picked it up.